Of randomly and violently attacking women, punching them with no warning.
Today, we're learning disturbing new information about the alleged serial puncher and his criminal past.
You know, I realized a long time ago on this channel that we are basically condemned in most circumstances for things to never really get that much better. And a perfect example of this, a perfect distillation of this, is the fact that I opened this video with a clip about somebody who had a lengthy criminal history that was described as a serial puncher, somebody who would assault women on the streets of the city of Chicago, and it took him to finally assault a police officer to actually get arrested and be held in jail pre-trial because he's a serious ongoing threat to society. But the local news segment, even though it's Chicago, even though they should know exactly why this guy was released time and time again, is asking questions about why nothing was done sooner.
Tara, you're asking why more wasn't done to prevent these attacks.
That's exactly what we're asking the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and the Chicago Police Department.
Well, wishes happen to be horses today because me, Sean, over at Actual Justice Warrior, will answer those very questions by diving into the history of Mr. Rucker, this so-called innocent Baba Angel Aladdin who just wanted to deck women in the face on subway platforms and on the streets and spit on them and assault them in all these crazy ways and has a lengthy criminal history. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody for preventing me from getting decked in the face over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
This man was actually in court today facing 6 felony charges, some of the first felony charges that he's faced, and we've learned that he's been ordered detained following that court hearing.
Charges ranging from battery and assault to trespassing and theft.
So look, we have some good news to start out with. First and foremost, local news reporter, obviously attractive, which I have to mention because you preverts out there in the audience will get angry if I don't. But in addition to that, this guy is actually being held pre-trial. However, that bit of good news that they finally decided to do something, again, finally, is kind of undercut by the sea of mugshots that we see, which exposes how many times this guy was arrested in the city of Chicago, only to be released back onto the streets over and over again. And again, it's not like he was arrested for loitering. It's not like he was arrested for jaywalking. His criminal history is exactly indicative of somebody who goes around punching people in the face all the time, because many of his arrests were for him going around and punching people in the face all of the time.
Charges ranging from battery and assault to trespassing and theft. Mugshots dating back to 2006. Take a look at your screen and you'll see the lengthy criminal charging history of 37-year-old Derek Rucker. In court today, facing 5 felony charges for aggravated batteries against women and a police officer. Rucker was arrested Thursday on State Street after police say he struck a 44-year-old woman in the face.
So look, Rucker obviously has a lengthy criminal history. Those batteries are the assaults that are obviously related and predictive of future crimes, but he's also doing other things. He's committing robberies, all sorts of other non-law-abiding behavior. And again, when you see a sea of mugshots from one specific individual and you wonder why they're not being incarcerated, chances are that some politician with some dumbass woke ideology happens to be behind it. And for a huge portion of these arrests, Kimberly Fox, a woke Black Lives Matter district attorney who doesn't want to prosecute anyone for anything, was in office. In fact, for 8 years of this guy's peak offending, she was the person in charge. She was the person who was dismissing these cases or reducing these cases or allowing him to serve as little time as humanly possible on these cases. And hopefully, now that they got a new state's attorney for Cook County, who seems to be doing a better job, genuinely, I'm being serious about that maybe finally he will be prosecuted, especially when you add in the public embarrassment of him not being prosecuted for so long in any kind of serious way. Again, 5 felony arrests for assaulting women and a police officer all at the same time. That means that a bunch of these mugshots, because he's not getting arrested for each and every crime, are actually representative of even more crimes, even more criminality that this guy's been allowed to get away with.
The scenes on your screen, the other incidents police say Rucker is behind the past few weeks. Police say he assaulted a Chicago police officer, punched a woman in the face with a closed fist, knocking her to the ground, spit on a woman, and punched a woman in the back of the head on a CTA platform.
So at what point point do we look at a lengthy criminal history like this? At what point do we look at the escalating violence and think to ourselves, hey, you know what? Maybe poverty is not at fault right here. Maybe the issue at hand in this particular case is not that we have to go out and put an APB on poverty. Maybe we need to hold Rucker accountable for his actions. Maybe we need to acknowledge that he's a serious ongoing threat to society because, again, even though he has a lengthy criminal history, it appears he is escalating in terms of violence because all of these attacks happened in a short period of time.
Spit on a woman and punched a woman in the back of the head on a CTA platform. Video posted on TikTok and obtained by the Chicago Tribune shows police arresting Rucker, the man in the blue, in that incident the end of last month.
And again, you could see the absolute disdain that he has for his victims because not only is he assaulting them, not only is he sucker punching them, not only is he targeting women, but he's also spitting on them after the fact. Again, this guy's a scumbag through and through. And for those of you who are going to say, well, what about mental illness? Can we figure out what mental illness is wearing and then arrest mental illness? Look, I'm interested in doing something about mental illness in this country. I think we need to open up asylums and whatnot and actually deal with people that, again, are not in control of their own mind. But the thing is that you guys need to understand is that the time to talk about mental illness is before we have a decade or 2-decade long criminal history and before 5 different people are getting sucker punched and spat on by this person. There's always this game that the left wing plays with mental illness, which is to say, oh my God, that's not just bad behavior. That's not just these criminals and not caring about the law and being absolute moral degenerates. They're actually the victim of a condition, and they say that, and then they try to use that as an excuse to release this dangerous person onto the streets time and time again. And what ultimately ends up happening, either they eventually get to the point where they seriously injure and or kill someone, or they get into an altercation that ends up costing them their own life. Perfect example of this, Jordan Neely. Everybody talked about Jordan Neely's mental illnesses, even though he punched an old woman in the face, broke her eye socket, sent her to the hospital, also broke her nose in that particular instance. But what they don't talk about is that Jordan Neely was offered help for mental illness and addiction treatment time and time again. But the way that the progressive policies were set up is that if he was sent to a mental health institution, even though he was a paranoid schizophrenic, he was not to be held there. He was to stay there voluntarily. And guess what? Shortly before Jordan Neely died, about 10 to 13 days after he was sentenced to that facility, he walked out of his own volition, which, by the way, makes sense because he's a paranoid schizophrenic. Even if at one point in time he was in the mindset to accept help, that might not always hold because the guy is mentally ill. So then he goes crazy on the train. He has to be restrained by Daniel Penny. And then all of a sudden, the city of New York decided that they were going to press serious charges against Daniel Penny, against the end result of their bad policies. That's when they decided that they are going to act. And that is far too late, in my opinion.
This person shouldn't be on the street.
Why? CBS News Chicago legal analyst Irv Miller pointing to a misdemeanor from November of last year. A misdemeanor, he says, should have been charged as a felony.
They knew at that time they did at least 30 arrests.
The police report from that case detailing Rucker spitting on the police officer arresting him after he assaulted a 62-year-old man with a belt and stick, cutting his head. Police said at the time they charged him with a misdemeanor because they couldn't reach his victim.
So yeah, this is called downcharging. This is something that happens all the time. And the Chicago police appear to be the ones who fumbled the bag right here because they had an assault with a weapon, which should be elevated to a felony. They cut the victim's head, and they claimed that they could only charge a misdemeanor, not a felony, because they couldn't reach the victim in time. But as we're going to find out, they basically gave the victim, who possibly was in the hospital, no time to respond.
When I asked Chicago police about that today, they reiterated they couldn't reach the victim. But
the problem with that is he was arrested at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they approved the misdemeanor charge at 6 o'clock at night. And that's not really a lot of time to look for somebody that's the victim of a serious crime.
Look, I told you that the Cook County prosecutor is actually significantly better than Kimberly Fox. Usually it would be the police submitting felony charges and her downgrading it. But in this particular case, the police absolutely messed up. They didn't care. And whether or not this is a directive from the Brandon Johnson administration or not makes no matter, because you have a lot of discretion at the ground level, being the officer on the scene, in order to push for felony charges. It wasn't pushed for. And guess what? 5 more women were assaulted by this guy who had a lengthy criminal history. Now, I know a bunch of the woke idiots will say, well, you can't really look at somebody's previous criminal history, their previous arrest record, in order to determine whether or not you can apply a habitual offender law and charge them with a felony under that. But in reality, yes, you absolutely can. And this idea that we're going to ignore your past, your pattern of behavior, and then expect that pattern of behavior to be corrected is insane. That's how you end up in a situation where a guy who should have been charged with a felony back in November ended up being able to commit these attacks for all of this time against all these different various victims. And now people are like, well, I guess we can hold him at least until people stop paying attention. And then maybe we could downgrade his charges on all of these assaults again, because, you know, innocent Baba Angel Aladdin, look at this guy in these mugshots.
And get this, Rucker was on felony probation at the time for assaulting a nurse in the hospital months before. Miller says police should have notified the state's attorney and sought felony charges, telling me these cases, all preventable.
If he would have been charged with a felony on the case involving the 62-year-old gentleman, I have no doubt that he would have been detained pending his trial in the Cook County Jail, and he would not have been on the streets, so it never would have happened.
Now again, it gets significantly worse. The guy was already on felony probation, which means he was let out after a felony assault on a nurse, a problem in the system. But when you're on probation, at least in theory, just like when you're on parole, and you commit other crimes, you could violate that probation or parole and send them to prison in order to complete their sentence. And it appears the police did not inform the Cook County office of this. Again, I don't know if this comes from the top, from the Brandon Johnson administration, but in reality, you can't have this nonsense going on. And this might be a case where 5 women were victimized because the police were either too lazy, or possibly there are directives from the Chicago mayor and the people of his ideology to not actually hold people accountable for their actions. But again, I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. Should this serial puncher have been in custody already, or do you think that he just needed some food, maybe some midnight basketball, in order to prevent himself from reoffending? As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about madness in the city of Chicago. Till next time.